And this brings me to my third and final section. I want to suggest that we do in fact live in a much more thoroughly integrated world than our culture has recognized, and that there are modes of knowing and being within that world which we can explore and which challenge the unhelpful polarizations of secularism. So my third part, believing and knowing in an integrated world. In many parts of the university world today, people assume that real intellectual work takes place in the objective world of the hard sciences, and that the more you move in the direction of the so-called arts, especially things like metaphysics or theology, the more you're simply talking nonsense about nothing. Again, that's a function of those Epicurean assumptions, not of the hard sciences themselves. There have been many periods and cultures in history that have developed very sophisticated scientific work without assuming that you had to split that off from other kinds of knowing, other aspects of culture. Nevertheless, many of today's leading scientists have been brought up on the split world viewpoint. Some have even, with unintended irony, made it an article of faith that one should not allow articles of faith into the classroom or the laboratory. Some Christians have gone along for the ride. 10 or 12 years ago, I was invited to speak at a think tank in Washington about Christian ecological work, working towards reduction of global warming and rescuing the planet from all the stuff that we've been doing to it. I was told afterwards that halfway through my talk, I had lost many of the Christians in the room because I had talked about scientific evidence for global warming. And the very mention of science, apparently, to my horror, sent a message that I was colluding with Darwinian atheism or something like it. That would be to make the mistake I mentioned before of confusing science with scientism, of placing the proper and wise investigation of the natural world within the worldview of Epicureanism, which is itself unproved and indeed unprovable. So what's the alternative? Here, perhaps to your surprise, the Christian worldview has a great deal to offer, especially when you track it back to its beginnings in the world of ancient Israel, and then of Jesus himself and the writings of the first 2 or 3 Christian centuries. And the category which emerges again and again in the scriptures and the great teachers of the faith is wisdom. Sophia in Greek, Chokmah in Hebrew. Wisdom. Wisdom is a strange, evocative figure, sometimes personified as a lady inviting people to a feast, teaching people how to navigate through this wonderful but dangerous world. Wisdom in the scriptures is what was possessed by the master builder who constructed the beautiful tabernacle. It's what Joseph was seen to possess when he advised Pharaoh how to cope with upcoming ecological and economic disaster. It's what Daniel had when he was able, uniquely, to read the writing that appeared on Belshazzar's wall. We in our culture have often split apart skills like architecture and engineering on the one hand, skills of philosophy or political insight on the other. The figure of wisdom holds them together. Wisdom, according to Scripture, is what you need to be genuinely, fully human. And genuine, full-rounded humanity is what our culture, with its pretense at religion and its variety of unnamed but powerful gods, has been remarkably short of. There are 3 steps to biblical wisdom. They're all summarized in a much repeated shorthand, which probably sounds forbidding to us. Again and again in the scriptures we hear, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, our problem with that is that we've all forgotten who the Lord is. And if you go out on the street and say to somebody, do you or don't you believe in God? And then you talk about which God it is they believe in or don't believe in. Again and again still, people will talk about the old bully in the sky. That's the one we don't believe in, or if we do believe in him, we're a bit frightened. We mistake God for a distant, faceless bureaucrat. And so we've forgotten that when the scripture talks about the fear of the Lord, it doesn't mean a cringing, nervous, slavish state, but the reverence and awe properly due to the creator and sustainer of all things. In other words, just as the concept of faith changes in accordance with its subject, if what you believe in is a being like an amorphous and characterless gas, that faith will be a very different thing from the sort of faith you have if what you believe in is the Father of Jesus Christ. So the word fear changes too, depending on whether the God you imagine is a celestial bully or the God of faithful love. And my point is this: in the biblical traditions, the human subject is imagined not as the lonely, isolated individual who can work things out for himself. In those traditions, it usually was a he, but rather as someone who is located in relation to three other coordinates. Let me mention the three briefly. First, the knowing subject is made in the image of the Creator. Part of the meaning of that evocative phrase is that the subject is called to reflect the Creator's wisdom and his care into the world, and so then to reflect the praises of creation back to the Creator. That is the human vocation. Second, the knowing that goes with wisdom, in the biblical sense, would see the object of study, whatever it is you're trying to know, not as an isolated entity that could be manipulated or exploited, but as part of a much larger world, full of interlocking connections and mutual relationships. But third, the knower never knows in isolation. All serious academic study takes place in the context of a community of knowers. True wisdom is both bold and humble. It will never be afraid to say what it thinks it has seen, but it will always covet other angles of vision. So where has this taken us? It's taken us to the point where we can see an integrated mode of knowing, quite different from the pure objectivism dreamed of in scientism on the one hand, and the supposedly pure subjectivism which the Epicurean scientist accuses his or her neighbour in the arts faculties of, especially in theology and similar subjects. No. All knowledge, suggests biblical wisdom, involves human beings in a much more complex series of relationships than simply that of the detached observer obtaining a supposed view from nowhere. Please note, the scientist studies that which can be repeated. The historian studies that which cannot be repeated. But in many other respects, the sequence of knowing is the same, from observation to hypothesis, to further testing, and all suffused with a wonder at the rich complexity of life, which is a different sort of life to ours. And other disciplines will do the same. The whole process requires humility and patience. It requires an unwillingness to grab at the material or to foist one's own ideas or personality on it. Ultimately, the different modes of knowing suggested by wisdom boil down to what we might call love. Love is a mode of knowing, all right. But love transcends the objective-subjective distinction, which has been so inscribed in much Western thinking. In love, the main thing is to admire and respect and celebrate and take delight in the object of that love, to let it be itself, to want it to be gloriously and wonderfully itself, not to snatch it or control it or squash it into another shape. That's not love, that's lust. Is love then the pursuit of objectivity? Of course not. Precisely at the same moment that love is celebrating the radical otherness of the beloved, whether it be a star 20 million miles away, 20 million light years away, or a human being 20 millimeters away, love is entering into a relationship with the beloved, a relationship which is again defined by the nature of the beloved, but in which admiration is mixed with curiosity, a desire to discover more, respect with a longing for intimacy, a desire to know and, so far as it is possible, to be known. What we've seen in the last 200 years of Western epistemology has been the splitting of love. It is, of course, possible to divide up different types of knowledge so that they appear almost entirely different or incompatible. And that enables the kind of knowledge we might acquire in the hard sciences to go steaming ahead unencumbered, producing, please note, not only penicillin, which was, of course, discovered by accident, but also gas chambers, which were made deliberately. It makes great strides, but not always in the right direction. We have 1,000 machines for making war, but none for making peace. We have computers and iPhone apps that will make millions of dollars out of a tiny change in exchange rates, but none that will rescue the poorest countries in the world from their plight. We know how to make internet pornography, but not how to repair marriages. The very objectivity or neutrality of scientific knowledge as commonly conceived has played into the hands of the gods we secretly worship. The chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Jonathan Sacks, one of our great commentators in the UK, says it like this: science takes things to bits to see how they work, religion puts them together to see what they mean, and they need each other. We have run the risk for too long of taking our whole world apart to see how it works, in order that we may make it work to our short-term advantage. Perhaps it's time to allow other perspectives to come into the frame. And for the Christian, of course, the central claim is that in Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, wisdom become human, become a person. Jesus went about bringing precisely that reintegration for which the world had longed, taking upon himself the disintegration and selfish hatred of the world, and rising again to launch the project of an integrated new creation. Modern science, insofar as I understand its origins, began with people who were in themselves quite devout, believing all this, exploring the natural world with respect and delight as the mysterious creation of a wise creator. But the Epicurean split world of the Enlightenment, embraced not least because of the political and social advantage that view is supposed to bring, encouraged a split world of knowledge, a two-track culture in which each side became increasingly opaque or even repellent to the other. And in your country at least, this has got itself hooked up with the so-called culture wars, greatly to the detriment of all parties. I believe it's time to work for a fresh integration. And I suggest to you that the figure of wisdom incarnate, Jesus himself, is the place to begin if we are to discover what that might mean, not only for ourselves, but for the wider world that knows only too well what a divided existence is like. The great claim made by the early Christians was not so much that in and through Jesus they had a secret knowledge. Some people tried to go that route, but Paul dismissed it and said that was just the route to pride. Their great claim was that in Jesus they had discovered a larger reality within which their own partial knowledge would make sense. And that larger reality was what they called agape, love. The love of the Creator God for them, and the love which they then found in themselves for the Creator, for his world, and particularly for one another and all others around. Authentic Christian faith, then, is not to be played off against scientific knowledge. Rightly understood, faith and knowledge are both offshoots of a larger reality, whose name is love. Jesus himself has, of course, been studied historically from every possible angle. Some have despaired of ever understanding him. Some have even questioned whether he ever existed, though no serious historian makes that mistake. As a historian, I can say with confidence not only that he really did live in first century Palestine, that he really did tell his surprised contemporaries that the one true God was now taking charge of the world in a whole new way, and that he went to his death believing that that was how God's powerful love would overcome the power of evil and launch new creation. And again, as a historian, I have to say that without Jesus' resurrection, I cannot explain why Jesus' disciples would have taken that claim seriously for 1 minute after his violent death. Of course, all this poses challenges for us at the level of worldview, as it did for Jesus' own contemporaries. They knew just as well as we do that dead people stayed dead. But Jesus' first followers not only believed that he really was alive again, but that he had, as it were, gone through death and out the other side, leading the way into a new mode of being in which the power of love would defeat the love of power, in which creation and beauty would win out over death and decay, and in which God himself would become present to and with people of every shape and type, offering healing and reconciliation, a new start, a new life, a new way of life. Sometimes, as in science, as in history, the great leap forward to a fresh hypothesis. I hope some of you will have the joy of that in your academic and professional lives. The great leap forward to a fresh hypothesis happens when you put a new element in the middle of the picture and discover that all the jumbled pieces come together in a new and coherent way around it. That's what it's like when you put Jesus as wisdom incarnate into the middle of the picture. Because it's Jesus, it doesn't happen all at once. He wants us to grow up and take responsibility, to think it through, to be learners, disciples, not just mute followers. But because it's Jesus, he offers and provides the strength and courage which enable us to believe, to learn, and to join in his project of healing and hope and love. Thank you very much.